Thank you. Committee, I will call the Standing Committee on Government Operations to order. And we'll start with a prayer. Mr. Thompson. Please rise.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dear God, thank you for this day as we work for the residents and constituents back home. As we make good decisions, please let us have open hearts, listening ears as we hear the presentation today. And thank you in Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Please be seated.
Thank you for appropriating the listening ears.
Okay, committee, there's an agenda before us. Today's business is a public briefing on the Northwest Territories Emergency Management Modernization Plan, and that is it. Are there any additions to the agenda? Can I get a motion to adopt the agenda, please? Thank you, Ms. Green. Declarations of conflict of interest? Hearing none. Oh, and sorry, just a bit of housekeeping. Ms. Green will be an alternate member for this meeting. Thank you. All right, with that, we will turn to today's committee business public briefing on the Northwest Territories Emergency Management Modernization Plan with the Honourable Caroline Cochrane, Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs. And before we get started, I will ask committee members to introduce themselves for the record, starting with Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson?
Good afternoon, R.J. Simpson, MLA, Hay River North.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Julie Green, Yellowknife Center.
Good afternoon. Welcome, Shane Thompson, Hindi.
And I am Kieron Testart, Chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations and member for Cam Lake. With me at the table are Ms. Jennifer Franki-Smith, Committee Clerk, and Ms. April Taylor, Committee Research Advisor. I will now turn the floor over to the Minister. Minister, you may proceed with any opening comments and your presentation. Simply direct the committee's attention to whoever will be completing with or delivering the presentation, and you will have 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm here today to brief committee members on a newly modernized Northwest Territories Emergency Management Plan and Framework. With me today from MACA, Municipal and Community Affairs, are Ms. Eleanor Young, Deputy Minister, Ivan Russell, Manager of Emergency Measures, Kevin Brzezinski, Director of Public Safety, Melissa Kruger, Senior Policy and Legislative Advisor, and my Ministerial Special Advisor, Mira Dunn. A short presentation has been provided to help describe the new Emergency Management Plan and Framework and the path which has led us to these documents. As you know, revitalizing the Northwest Territories Emergency Plan is a priority for the 18th Legislative Assembly. Climate change and recent emergency events have highlighted a real need to improve the governments of the Northwest Territories' approach to emergency management. Working closely with all government and Northwest Territory departments, these instruments represent lessons learned from previous events and best practices from across Canada. They provide the structure and guidelines on how the government of the Northwest Territories and its partners work together to support community governments and meet a collective responsibility in responding to territorial emergencies. I wish to acknowledge the contributions of staff from all government of the Northwest Territory departments who contributed significantly to the development of these important documents and the preparations which are now taking place to put these instruments into place. Ms. Young will now deliver the presentation, and your comments and input are most welcome afterwards. Thank you.
So starting with the purpose slide, the presentation today is intended to provide you with a broad overview of the work underway to modernize the NWT Emergency Plan. The package that we've provided for this item contains a number of documents which represent the entire emergency management system. Included in our package is a framework document providing a public overview of our new emergency management system, an emergency plan which describes the GNWT's new emergency response arrangements, which include new evacuation guidelines to guide the planning and conduct of community evacuations, and a new emergency communications protocol to guide how we coordinate crisis communications during emergencies. Also included are an implementation plan overview, which describes our approach to implementation, and an executive communications plan to help ensure that adequate public and stakeholder communications are happening when we go live. This work represents the efforts of an interdepartmental planning committee over the past 2 years, which includes representatives from most departments within the government of the Northwest Territories. On the next slide, there are a few bullets to provide a basic description of the NWT Emergency Plan. All jurisdictions in Canada rely on these kinds of plans to help coordinate emergency response activities among departments and partners. The NWT's emergency plan has been around for quite some time, and it was actually last updated formally 17 years ago. On the next page, the chart shows the activations over the last few years that we've seen, so 5-year period there. It does not include events which were monitored or planning and preparation activities that help sustain emergency management systems. You can obviously see by the chart that wildfire emergencies and floods and powers are well represented. The other category, just for your information, because we often get asked, in 2012-13, we had a gas supply shortage issue in Norman Wells, which there was a state of local emergency called. And in 2016-17, there was an ammonia leak in the center part of Hay River, which also had an emergency declaration established. On the next slide, you see a number of reasons on why this work has been happening. Our current plan, as already referenced, has been outdated, and it doesn't include a renewal mechanism, current best practice, or lessons learned since the last review. The NWT risk profile is changing. Climate change is a major factor, resulting in increased frequency and severity of wildfires and floods in particular, but we also see things like coastal erosion starting to cause concern in a number of our communities. We've also noted that through the federal disaster financial assistance arrangements, we've been fortunate enough to recover approximately $6 million in emergency response costs over the last 12 years, and we have about $4.7 million still outstanding from the 2014 wildfire season response. But at the end of the day, the expectations with Canada are growing in terms of accountability and work on emergency management systems, and we have to do everything that we can do to better coordinate and organize ourselves, the better chance we have to recover costs from Canada when significant expenditures are made. And we did want to note that Canada itself is updating its emergency framework, and the work that we're doing allows us to stay consistent with what's happening nationally in terms of emergency management. On the next slide, you see quite a number of items that speak to the progress to date, going back to 2014 when we did our updated hazard identification risk assessment. An integral part of this project also includes a new territorial emergency management legislation, which will formally establish the NWT Emergency Management Organization, an interdepartmental planning committee, and also the authority for a territorial emergency plan. Our expectation is that we'll be launching this NWT emergency plan in concert with the new emergency management legislation, and we've been working quite closely with departments, regions, and stakeholders throughout all of these activities that are listed in the progress to date. What's new in the next slide talks about the fundamental difference between the old plan and the new one, and that is the adoption of a systematic approach to emergency management using what's called the Incident Command System. The Incident Command System, or ICS, is an incident management tool that provides a standardized and coordinated approach to managing emergencies and functional interoperability at all levels of emergency management. This is the system that has been used historically in the fire system, so one of the things that will really help with is making sure that we're using consistent language, consistent approach in terms to emergency response across departments. It's worth noting that ICS is a well-accepted best practices and currently a common operating model across most of our partners in other jurisdictions. The next slide speaks to the concept of operations for emergency management, and I'll draw your attention first and foremost to the bottom right corner, because if you've seen any of the national public information types of things, they talk about emergency management starting with the individual, and you'll often see the 72-hour preparedness kind of advertising where it talks about how, you know, first and foremost, it's up to the individual to have themselves prepared for a period of time where the power might be out and your community has to get organized to be able to respond to the issue. And then the system, the levels of assistance go up from there as individual or community or territorial response is exceeded and additional assistance is required. And those levels of assistance can be guided by emergency plans and predetermined arrangements like mutual aid. The NWT Emergency Plan guides how the GNWT supports communities and responds to major emergencies. It also includes mechanisms to assist other jurisdictions. It guides the territory and regional response, which is consistent with how GNWT programs and services are delivered in general. In addition to the incident command system, other key components of the new NWT Emergency Plan include the use of subject matter experts, surge capacity for staffing, and an emergency planning committee. And I'll speak to each of those items separately. So first off, with subject matter experts, these are individuals who will be identified relative to the hazards that are prevalent in our operating environment, the basis of which will be the NWT Hazard Identification Risk Assessment. The new Territorial Planning Committee will help inform recommendations in this regard on who the subject matter experts should be, and it's a list that will need to be maintained and updated. This is the kind of thing where you want to have people who are the ones who can give us information on floodwater expectations or where to expect the fire risk to be, based on current information and weather patterns. Surge capacity, one important capability that we're wanting to build into this new system is a surge capacity. As you all know, we're a very small jurisdiction. We have limited capacity to manage large, complex events or events that continue on for some time, and the 2014 fire being a great example of that, where we had folks who were really reaching the end of their capacity to respond and be part of the system due to the length of time that event took place. So the goal with surge capacity is to be able to reach out to departments for staff who can support us in managing emergencies. They're already trained, they're experienced people that are available to draw upon in a pre-arranged and timely fashion. Likely candidates would be those who already have some kind of a job related to skills in emergency management or crisis response, and they could benefit from training and exercises in incident command system. And the NWT Emergency Planning Committee, through the new Emergency Management Act, we're creating a Territorial Planning Committee, which will function for the purpose of developing, maintaining, and testing the NWT Emergency Plan and system. The intent is for departments to participate in shaping, maintaining, and testing our emergency management system and instill confidence in the public. One of the key things when it comes to emergency planning committees is having individuals as part of that committee who are in a position to make decisions and engage the folks in their department as required for emergency response. The next slide speaks to our implementation plan. We've already started our training in the regions and for departments. We anticipate that the full suite of training will happen over the next year or so, and then there will be ongoing sustainment training from there, as well as individual training requirements as needed, as we recommend. In order to ensure our plan meets our expectations, we're also participating in the military Op-Nanook exercise, which is scheduled for September of 2018, primarily based out of Betchico. And our goal will be to validate the major components of our plan through and operational procedures through that exercise. Also, once we've been operational for a year, we do intend to assess our response activity and update the plan as required. And then after that first year, an annual review will become an agenda item for the NWT Emergency Planning Committee. This is really no different than what we do currently with emergencies, where we have after-action reviews and look at continual improvement of the system. This will just be formalizing that through an annual review process, making sure that we do that, build that into our sustainment training and exercises so that we're making sure we've got skills and experience within the system to be able to respond. The next slide shows you the next steps, and highlighted in red is where we are today with the briefing to standing committee. You will note that the next item on that next step list is the first and second reading of the Emergency Measures Act, and we are told that we can expect that to be introduced in the House next week. You'll see the timeline there for the next 12 months or so, and the goal is to have this emergency plan approved in conjunction with that new legislation, and we would have them both come into force at the same time. Again, we will be working through the process that exists, and we're hoping to have the legislation in for third reading in the the May session, but if that does not happen, then we would aim for the fall session. Again, subject to the process and the discussions and review that will take place from here. I talked very quickly, but that concludes the presentation. We'll welcome any questions you may have, and thank you for your time on the presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Young, and you did an excellent job. You've got 8 minutes left. But committee will take that from you. So just before we get started with general questions from committee members, I note in your timeline on, excuse me, the slides aren't my slide deck isn't numbered, but on your progress to date, we have a legislative proposal for the Emergency Management Act with a indication of year of 2015. And now we have the intention in the next steps to proceed with first reading of a bill. So unless someone can correct me here, but we've just been speaking with staff, we haven't seen an LP. This committee hasn't seen an LP. And of course, that LP would have gone to the previous one. But does the department have, or Minister, do you have the approval of cabinet to move forward with a bill without first sharing an LP with committee, as is our normal process? I understand that sometimes that can be waived if it was an LP that's been previously viewed, but has that discussion been had? Are you aware of that, Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, because the LP was already presented and approved in the last assembly, then we are looking at just putting forward the first and second reading. In my opinion, because climate change is drastic, we are having huge forest fire issues, and there was an incident in one of the communities that it wasn't very well coordinated. So I think this is a priority. I think we need to get this out. This is really actually spells out who is responsible for what. And so I would hate to actually go backwards and start from the beginning when I do know that after we present the first and second reading that we can actually, you have 120 days to work on that still. I'm conscious of the time. I really want to push it for the May reading because that's the start of our fire season. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Madam Minister. The only concern, I guess, from committee is that we only recently took on, or in the life of this assembly, the Standing Committee on Government Operations took over the mandate of Municipal and Community Affairs from what was then the Economic Development Committee. So committee mandates have changed, and my understanding of past practice is that when LPs have been waived for a new committee and a new government, that there is some concurrence between the committee and the minister. So perhaps we could have further discussion on this outside of this briefing and at the very least see the LP so we can familiarize ourselves with it as committee members and discuss this issue further. But of course, emergency management is a key concern for all members of this committee and all members of the House, and we want to make sure communities are safe. We just want to make sure that we have the opportunity to see the legislation as per our consensus governing protocols. But we'll discuss that after. I'll now turn to committee and see if anyone has questions. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess the first question is, how is this, we talk about this as being a new committee, and how is this different than the previous system that was in place? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Thompson. And just for clarification, we'll allow a free exchange of information here, so there's no need to wait for me to intervene. So your 10 minutes starts now. Minister, you may respond.
Chair. There have been some changes. The last Civil Emergencies Measures Act was last updated in 2001. That's 17 years ago. So what's new, and I will ask staff if they want to expand on it, we've done now in this new plan, the new act that will be coming out, we have evacuation guidelines to guide the planning and conduct of the community evacuations. That wasn't there. We have a new emergency communications protocol to coordinate crisis communications. In the Act, we have a new interdepartmental emergency planning committee that's responsible for developing, maintaining, testing the responses. We have a new systemic approach using the incident command system, which my deputy minister talked about, which talks about standards and coordinated approaches to manage emergencies at all levels. And I will ask if there's any additional to that that has changed, if that's all right, Mr. Chair.
I just wanted to add that the changes and update are all based on like lessons learned previously, best practice and research we've done in other jurisdictions, plus all the input that we've gotten from stakeholders, communities, our departments and so on. So that has guided what has gone into this, and those are the primary changes.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Russell, I believe it is, correct? I guess my thing is that I've been part of this. I was in the incident. I've had the pleasure of doing fires. I had the pleasure of doing floods. And so when we talk about new, how is this different? Because I knew we had a process. We had a communication strategy. We had an evacuation strategy. We had all these things. The department had all these things in the past. So how is this been enhanced? I guess that's the big question, Minister. Oh, you don't have to touch the buttons. He does it.
Minister, just to introduce your witness for the record,
Oh.
please, when you get a hand off.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. I just got to get Ivan's last name.
Russell.
Ivan Russell will be speaking to that. Thank you.
Sorry, I just had to rethink there. One of the key things we know is it's been very difficult to look at past events and to substantiate our claims to the federal government in regard to disaster assistance. Our accountability is not what it should be to be able to really analyze and learn lessons from that. Part of our new system is a commitment to do that, to do after action reviews, to do lessons learned, and a great support for that is going to be the incident command system, which requires much more accountability in regard to maintaining logs, listing everything from expenditures, authorities, who said what, who approved what, and so on. And all that will go into the renewal process so that at the end of the year, when we review our activities, we can update our plan to provide that continuous improvement. The old plan did not have a renewal mechanism in it. It had some good elements. And the other aspect is we're clarifying the roles and creating an emergency management organization. So those roles will be very straightforward when it comes to things like training, how we organize and structure so we have a common approach across all regions. Because currently it's been a little bit different in how the old plan has been interpreted. So this will clarify a lot of that.
Oh,
Minister, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add on that. Some things aren't new in it, some things will be retained, but the most critical thing to recognize is that with climate change, our emergencies are getting more drastic, they're more intense now. And this is an Emergency Measures Act. This, and it wasn't spelled out in the Act, and so I want to emphasize on that. This actually talks about a renewals time. Emergency measures should not be something that sits on a shelf for 17 years. It should be something that's regularly reviewed. We should be looking at best practices across the jurisdictions to implement those. This is critical. This is about people's lives and communities. So if at the least, just having the renewal and the review period in that is a step up, I think. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
thank you, Minister. I greatly appreciate that, but I'm still struggling with the new part. Because I'm sitting here, I've been in a situation where we've had forest fires, we've had floods, and I understand the importance and the safety factor and life are at the balance of that. And I've seen the departments work together at regional level and then, extend it to the territorial level. So when I'm looking at this, is the regional level going to be changing now? Is there just going to be a headquarters / regional people working on this? Or is it still going to be structured that if it's a regional issue, let's say Sumbakay, there's a fire issue. So it's the regional office and the regional, DHO region working on that? Is that the process? Or is this something gonna be on to headquarters and then evolve from there? Thank you, Thank you, Minister.
So headquarters or our emergency management organization will be the hierarchical that'll be looking at things to make sure everything is kind of on track. We work with the cross-jurisdictional if we need to share services. We work with if there's a national Canadian emergency, that would be their piece. Underneath that, the regional emergency management operations will support the communities if they need help. Underneath that comes the local governments that actually, and it spells out their roles within that and clearly defines their delegation of authority on who can declare a state of emergency, either local or territorial wide. And then it also talks, which is interesting, about each department and what their specific roles are within the emergency planning, what ENR is responsible for, what housing is responsible. So it's a lot more comprehensive. It's very integrated and comprehensive. And I'll let, if Eleanor wants to expand on that. Eleanor Young will expand.
Thank you, Minister. And I think I'll use a couple examples from the DHO as to illustrate some of the changes. As you say, we've done evacuations and many of these things many times over the past, but we actually haven't had a territorial template for evacuations or a territorial communications approach. And so when it's come to the federal claims, as Ivan explains, we've had issues where who authorizes expenditures has come into question, and then the claiming of those expenditures has come into question. We saw issues on an evacuation last year on who issued the order for the evacuation and whether that was done with the appropriate authority. That came into question then when it came to claiming those expenses back. We've seen confusion on communications on who it is you're supposed to get updates from and how those updates are fed to folks like yourselves when the emergency is in your region. And so with these territorially adopted evacuation plans, communication plans, that will hopefully be much clearer to all of you, to all of the departments, so that we're all following the same songbook when it comes to who's making those decisions, how they're being made, and then allowing us to claim what's appropriate back from Canada, so that we're not, as you see, 2014 is a long time to be waiting for $4 million. A lot of that comes back to how we've documented and claimed that money and having to go back and explain why a decision's made around Nahanni Butte, why we paid for fridges, was a question we had to debate with Canada for a number of months. What we were doing with private homes versus housing corporation units became a huge debate on why we were paying expenses different ways. So this process is intended to clean a lot of that up so that, as Ivan said, the accountability is there. We'll have a lot less difficulty claiming expenditures back from Canada. And from the federal end, to be much clearer on what is being paid by what jurisdiction. And that's a lot of what this is intended to do. None of it's stuff that we haven't done before, but we're now creating a territorial approach to all of these things that hopefully will clear a lot of those issues up.
I appreciate that. So I guess my next question though is that we're talking with this territorial new strategy, that have you guys vented this with the federal government? Because this seems to be the challenge, is it's not so much what's happening local, regional, or territorial, it's the next step is the federal territorial. So has this plan been, or is this plan going to be vented with the federal government so that they know exactly where we're moving on? Thank you.
Mr. Thompson, your time has expired, but I will allow the minutes. I'll allow Mr. Russell to respond. Thank you. Mr. Russell, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Public Safety Canada was engaged as part of the planning process for this and had the opportunity to provide comments and input back to the regional coordinator, which is our main contact for federal support and engagement on disaster financial assistance. So they were very much involved.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. I'll now move to Mr. Simpson. You have the floor.
Thank you. This past July, there were members of Canadian military in Hay River and the region working on an emergency preparedness plan. They were determining locations that people could be evacuated to, where farm animals could be evacuated to. And I was wondering, is that related to this, the work that is being done on this? Thank you, Mr. Chair, or rather.
Mr. Russell will speak to that.
We've been engaged with the local military here for some time now in ongoing emergency preparedness and cooperation. And they wanted to assist us and learn more about our processes. So as we went through the development of our new plan, we know we need to do some work in the area of evacuations and hosting evacuations. So they offered to do assessments of key communities that we would use as our hosting centers to assist them and give them the information they may need to improve upon what they currently have to host evacuees. We did one with Yellowknife a short while ago. We did the one with Hay River, and we have plans to do it with our other regional centers as well.
Thank you very much for that, and that's good to hear because I know they did a very thorough job. You know, they didn't just speak to municipal government, they spoke to individuals who happen to have large buildings that might be used for evacuation or this type of stuff. So they did a very, very thorough job, and I met with them, and I'm glad to hear that that's incorporated into this. And maybe to exemplify the changes that you're talking about, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but the specifics of it, Kakiza was evacuated a few years ago, and most people went to Hay River. And there was some issues, or, you know, depending on who you talk to, there were some issues about coordination, and, you know, the community sort of coordinated things themselves. And I was wondering, how would that scenario play out now, or rather when this becomes law? How would it be different? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So each community government is responsible for developing an emergency plan. We're working closely with them, and within those emergency plans, they will specify what procedures are used to when they evacuate, recognizing that, like was said earlier, this is a very fluid procedure. So some pieces, it wouldn't be full evacuation. It might be just a piece that they need. So it gives them some flexibility, but each community is responsible for developing their own emergency plan with the support of municipal and community affairs, that they would have that. Because it is the local communities that are often impacted at the beginning. So it's important that we give them the support and the tools, so that, and the exercise and the training, we offer them training as well, so that when an emergency happens, they are prepared. They do have a template, they do have a procedure to follow with that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and I understand that. I just, what happened when Kakiza was evacuated? How would it be different now? Like specifically, how would it be different now? What procedures would be different? What lines of communications would be different? All those kind of specifics I was wondering, just to sort of flesh this out a little bit, if someone could answer that for me.
I'll let Mr. Russell answer.
One of the key
Sorry, Mr. Russell? Go ahead.
One of the key learnings from the Kakiza incident was we realized we need clarity around roles and responsibilities. What should the community be doing? What should the government be doing? And how do we all work together to make decisions for evacuations? Where do they go? How do they move? And so on. So after that, we developed an interim guidelines for community evacuations, which we shared. And that was further developed into our plan, into our guidelines in our plan today. If that incident was to happen today, and in addition to that, we also did a planning workshop with Kakiza to make sure their plan was updated afterwards. So if that was to happen today, I think there'd be much more clarity and ease on residents and knowledge and understanding about evacuations, who does what, where they go, and how we all communicate together. So I hope that answers.
Back to Mr. Simpson.
Thank you for that, and nothing further, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Simpson. Anything further? We have time for 10 more minutes of questions. Mr. Nakamayak?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have much. I'm just looking at on the what's new on the incident command system. It says in use by emergency management partners across NWT, ENR, RCMP, JTFN, and federal partners. I'm just wondering if there's what do you have for in case of cruise ships, shipping, anything with shipping along the Northwest Passage or in the Beaufort Delta?
Minister Cochrane?
Mr. Russell will answer that. Thank you.
Our emergency plan is designed to look at all hazards, and we would work through the Inuvik region and our EMO up there to deal with things like cruise ships if it was to occur in that area. We have participated in the past in tabletop exercises hosted by the federal government, Transport Canada, Coast Guard, and so on, in relation to incidents in the Beaufort Sea and with cruise ships. So we have good awareness of who the key players are and who we can work to and how we can bring that together during an emergency.
And then, Mr. Chair, Ms. Young would like to expand as well.
Just raise your hand, Ms. Young.
I just also wanted to clarify, so again, the offshore would be the responsibility of the federal government to play the lead role, but our role would be to support the communities if they're receiving, for example, people off the cruise ships if there was a situation, or if there was an oil spill or something that would impact the community. So again, you know, our role is as the territorial government implementing the territorial plan. The offshore role would be the federal government, but we obviously have to work together in responding to an incident that happens in the offshore. Just wanted to draw that linkage.
And getting to that, I'm wondering if you know, how the shoreline and with erosion and accessibility to ports, which or a lack of. I know in some communities there's really no docks, but I'm just wondering if there's any to support the communities. If the department would look at mapping, mapping around the communities, accessibility, identifying places of some harbors and some even radar sites and things like that. Working with the JTFN or the North Warning System, use of drones to map areas in the community.
Okay, Ms. Young, go ahead.
Thank you. It's not part of this exercise per se. I would say that during some of our disaster mitigation projects, that is, where we're working on, for example, in Tuck and Aklavik, flood mapping and risk-related flood mapping and erosion are part of those exercises. When it comes to staging, opportunities to respond as part of an emergency, I'm sure that we could work with the community to look for resources to do that work. It's not specifically part of this exercise currently.
Yep, go ahead, Mr. Nakamayak.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And working with the communities, there's a lack of capacity in some of the communities. I know in my hometown, being part of the Hamlet Council years ago, we had an action plan. But sometimes when disasters don't happen, people forget about those plans and don't practice them or exercise them. I think it's good that important for the department to go out to each community and dust them off and sharpen them up for the next 5 years. That's all I really have, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Nakamayak. I'll allow the minister to respond. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, that is part of the plan within this, is that there would be regular reviews, and we are planning that with each new council that comes on, they would be provided with an emergency orientation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Minister. And with that, there appears to be no further questions from committee members. I'll ask you to excuse yourself, and committee will go on camera and discuss our wrap-up. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, witnesses.